Our next session is The Rise and Fall of Mughal Art. And on this session, we have J.P. Losty, Katherine Butler Schofield, Suzanne Stronge, Malini Roy in conversation with William Dalrymple. Sorry, Dalrymple. This session is presented by Aga Khan Foundation. And may I request you to keep your phones on silent mode.
Thank you. We're in the premises of one of the great collections of Mughal art in the world. And to my right are two of the great art historians of that collection. They put on a fantastic exhibition I'm sure many of you saw 3 years ago, 4 years ago?
2012.
5 years ago. Which showcased to a country that had forgotten quite the treasures contained in this collection, the remarkable British Library treasures. Malini told me that she called up from the vaults every day 10 boxes of...
I wouldn't say 10, but we went through quite a bit of material.
Every day, the stuff that hadn't been taken out of the recesses for possibly
a long time.
And found wonderful surprises like the Kabutanama,
yes.
the Book of Pigeons, which had never before been displayed. But it was a fantastic, fantastic show. Their rival across London is Sue, who runs the rival collection in the V&A, which is, again, an extraordinary collection, partly, I think, from the India House Museum, collected by the East India Company, but a great deal of it collected in the 1950s and 60s by somebody called Bill Archer, who bought, at a time when you could buy a Pahari miniature that today would sell for £150,000, were being bought up at the rate of 5 or 6 rupees each, hoovered up from the families of these artists in the hills, and in many ways is a post-colonial collection.
It certainly predates the V&A. I mean, and it goes right up and we collect to this day.
An extraordinary collection. And to my left, Katherine Butler Schofield, who is primarily a historian of music, but who is increasingly interested in Mughal art and this extraordinary way in which art and music come together in the Ragmala pictures, and the two bounce off each other. The Mughals arguably were, of all the dynasties in Indian history, the one that made most of the visual world and used art not only as something decorative that they wanted around them, but as something that was useful as a tool of power. And the way that the Mughals used art as a way of reinforcing their rule, reinforcing their image as rulers, and indeed as straightforward propaganda, is an extraordinary story. The other extraordinary thing, which one always has to remember, is the fact that this is a Muslim dynasty, whose holy books are often dubious about the whole business of the representation of the human form, ended up producing some of the greatest figurative portraits and some of the most extraordinary images of the human form in world history. And so it's an extraordinary story. And what I hope to do over the next hour with this extraordinary panel is to have a canter rapidly through the history of Mughal art, from its origins at the time of Akbar through to the final great flourish that took place under the last emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar. So, Jerry, to start with you, what was going on in India in terms of painting when Babur was massing his troops in Kabul, waiting for Humayun to turn up to invade India? Having been given, and the story, which lovely story in the Baburnama, is Babur does not particularly want to come to India, and then one of the Lodi's generals appears at his court with a jar of mangoes marinated in honey. And it is the mango that lures Babur to India. As good a reason as any, still, to go to India, really. Jerry.
Well, what was going on? Like most periods of Indian history, the medieval period, by which I mean between the classic period, say ending 1200, and the early modern period, which sort of begins with the Mughals, is a lot of it is shrouded in mystery. We don't have much that survived in terms of the painting or the manuscripts of that period. We have a relatively small number of manuscripts surviving, and of them a relatively small number are illustrated. So what they are various styles. There's the Persianate element which came into India with the Turkish Muslim conquest after 1193, and sultans throughout North India and the central India, the Deccan, patronized the book arts in the way that they also did in Persia. So we have evidence of what we call Sultanate painting, which is Indian painting in a Persianate style from the 15th century onwards, by the late 14th century. What was left of traditional Hindu and Buddhist patronage was very little, but it seems to have revived in the late 15th century. And in the 16th century we have paintings which, for want of a better word, have been termed the early Rajput style, because they lead on, leaping over the Mughals to the 17th century Rajput styles of Mewar and other states in Rajasthan.
Of the stuff you have here in the British Library, what's your favourite of the pre-Mughal stuff? The Nimatnama, that's lovely. It's a book of pleasures, done in Mandu, and it contains advice on scent, cooking, sex, and sport. It's like GQ. It's sort of
Well, I think it's everyone's favourite manuscript, not only because of its subject, but because of its extraordinary way that you can see the mixture of styles going on. We can see the Persian style from Shiraz, one of the great centres of Persian painting from the 15th century, 14th century onwards, influencing Indian artists who paint in a style that almost certainly leads on to this early Rajput style. So this is a manuscript which is dated between 1495 and 1505, and you can see this mingling of styles, the first serious evidence of this happening in India.
And Babur appears, he beats the Lodis at the Battle of Panipat, but he doesn't have much opportunity to settle down and commission anything, or maybe he does.
No, he doesn't, because he dies within 4 years, and within that time he's busy conquering other bits of India and fighting Hindu resistance in Rajasthan in particular. He's succeeded by Humayun, his son, who's a much more literary and cultured figure by all accounts, but much less effective as a ruler, and he was constantly fighting against the Afghan dynasty, the remnants of the Afghan dynasty which had ruled Delhi before Babur's conquest in 1526. Constant rebellions. They actually drove him out of India in 1540, and he took refuge eventually with Shah Tahmasp Shah Tahmasp of Iran. He went to Tabriz, and there, one of the key events in the history of Mughal painting, he came into contact with the cream of Safavid painting, the manuscripts which were produced for Shah Tahmasp, his great Shahnama of the 1520s, his Hamsa of Nizami, which is one of the great treasures here in the British Library. And I actually, assuming he saw these things, I think we have no doubt that he did, because he seems to have been seized by a similar desire to create his own manuscript studio for the production and illustration of manuscripts. And when he finally he got back a bit of his own kingdom in 1545 in Kabul, which at that time was always part of the Indian world, and within a few years he was joined by two of the key Safavid artists who had worked for Shah Tahmasp. They produced some beautiful things.
There are images of Humayun and Shah Tahmasp on display.
They are indeed in the Akbar Nama, Humayun's son's Akbar, Humayun's son Akbar's Akbar Nama, the history of Akbar, showing Humayun in Persia.
But in the display, in the treasure display.
I believe the meeting of Humayun and Shah Jahan is actually on display. Yes.
So if you want to actually see what they're talking about, and you can't see much going on the screen, the actual real object is on display 500 yards from here inside the library. So carry on. So he brings these two artists from Persia.
Yeah, 1545, 1546. Eventually, Humayun was felt as the Afghan dynasty in Delhi weakened. Humayun felt strong enough to invade India, which he did in 1555. He got rid of the last of the Shah dynasty, and gained the throne of Delhi. And unfortunately, he was killed the following year when he fell down the steps of his library in Delhi, which is in a tower within the Purana Killa complex.
Having smoked too much? Or opium?
What was his weakness was astrology, I think. He went up to look at the stars for a certain time of the night. And if you've ever been up that tower, one used to be able to go up it. I don't think it's possible now. The Archaeological Survey doesn't want any more fatalities. But it's an extremely steep staircase, like all these old Indian staircases. So his 14-year-old son, Akbar, took over. A totally different character. Key question.
So,
Hug me.
So a few years ago, the rival joint down in South Kensington put on a show on the Hamzanama. Sue, do you want to talk a little bit about about the Hamzanama?
Well, also the
We have the volume up slightly.
Can you hear? I mean, can you hear right at the back?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll shout. What happens in the early years of Akbar's reign is absolutely extraordinary, because you have this young man who starts off under the tutelage of one of his father's generals, massively expanding the very fragile kingdom that he inherited from his father. Now, what this means in artistic terms is that the traditions of all the regions that he conquers are absorbed into the central workshops of his court. And the fundamental paradox of his reign, of course, is that he was the patron of all these marvellous manuscripts. He couldn't read, and he was actually functionally illiterate. But that doesn't mean that he was ignorant, because at the court you would have court readers, and the current theory is that he was actually dyslexic. And so he had a marvellous memory and was as literary and educated as it's possible to be without actually being able to read the books that he commissioned. But the two Iranian master artists, Mir Said Ali and Abdus Samad, started to establish a much more expanded workshop, absorbing into it many of the artists from these conquered kingdoms, so predominantly Hindu, but with some Indian Muslims as well. And they started, under the guidance of the Iranian masters, to produce over 15 years the epic tales of Hamza. And Hamza is a partly mythical figure. The tales boil down to the battle between good and evil as the Muslim ruler fights against the infidels. And on this loop of images that you may or may not be able to see, one of the early, if you can work out the chronology, you'll see a painting from the Hamzanama, which is this early, rather large format manuscript, which was produced in multiple volumes. The sources disagree to some extent, but perhaps as many as 14, but with 1,200 illustrations, of which fewer than 200 have survived. And I think the British Library has, no, British Museum has one, you have none.
But we at the V&A...
we have 27, two of which are for limited periods in our primary South Asian gallery. They are incredibly fragile, and ours have been very damaged because they were found by a former curator in the 1880s in Kashmir, blocking up the windows of a curiosity shop. So they've been rained on, they've been burnt, they've had probably local Afghans perhaps rubbing out the faces, because this was a rare occasion in the Indian subcontinent where there was an objection to the depiction of living beings.
But this was intended to be the kind of Netflix of its day.
I don't know.
This
what
was
you
for
mean.
public. So this was the public recitation of the Hamzanama in court and you'd hold up a picture.
Well, that's one theory, but I'm sceptical about this. I mean, they were certainly oral tales. I mean, throughout the Muslim world, these were tales which were recited and performed, and it was Akbar's innovation to have them written down in Persian, the language of the court, which became the language of the empire, the administrative and cultural language of the empire. And he had them written down and illustrated, and they were in bound volumes. Now they're very large, they're about that big, so I presume that they were on book rests. But at the same time, there is certainly evidence that they were performed and recited as court entertainment, because this is a very literate world where poems and so on would be not only recited, but there would be extempore performances. So you'd respond to a poem with a response in the same meter, and so on.
Which continued on the steps of the Jama Masjid until the 19th century?
And it's what happens in Iran today. And it's a strongly Iranian cultural tradition which is informing the shape of what was being produced, but at the same time it's absorbing lots of traditions from within the subcontinent. And what happens at the end of this 15 years of bringing together artists trained in completely different visual traditions with the Iranian court artists, that you have a new style being produced. And this is one which is occasionally rather crude. In a single picture, you'll see passages of great sophistication and high ornamentation with some rather frankly sloppy painting. But at the end of the process, you have a more assimilated style, which is syncretic, and then that leads into the great manuscripts which you have in the British Library on show as well.
And so, towards the end, having had this moment of these two different worlds coming together, artists from Gujarat, artists from Persia, working together on one page?
Absolutely. In certain manuscripts, you would have the master artist doing the outline of the composition, and then we think the junior artist doing the actual colouring, and presumably some overarching supervisor who would be the supervisor of the workshop, the House of Books.
So in contrast to the situation in later Rajput courts, where you had a family group working father to son, with maybe a wife helping to mix, or even female artists also working together. This is an imperial workshop. It's in the palace. It is an ustad with a kind of stick and young applicants from other ends of the empire.
Well, at this period in Akbar's reign, you would have both the elements that you described, because you would have the court workshop, which would be in the Kitabkhane, the House of Books, which was not only the place where the manuscripts were stored, it was the library, but it was also the place where manuscripts were being created. And certainly the artists were being trained by their fathers, and there were family networks within that, we know that. The library itself might move as the court moved. So Akbar moved from Fatehpur Sikri to Lahore to Agra, and then you have librarians' annotations on the key manuscripts to show that they were in these different places. And then in Jahangir's reign, the pattern changes slightly.
So towards the end of Akbar's reign, Prince Salim rebels and goes off to Allahabad. Mm-hmm. And he takes with him many of the key artists.
He takes a few, and this is a subject to some dispute at the moment. It's probably not as large a number as some art historians suggest, because what happened was Salim was in rebellion against his father for 4 years and set up a rival court in Allahabad. That's without doubt. But if you look carefully at the dates that he was in Allahabad, it was a very short time. One of his wives died, and he was absolutely grief-stricken. It was a period when his addiction to opium was extreme, and so he wasn't perhaps overseeing, the production of manuscripts. Some were definitely produced in Allahabad.
There's that lovely thing that was displayed in Washington a few years ago, the yoga manual.
Yes.
And that
definitely
that was
produced
done.
Because the colophon says that.
So he's sitting there in the fort, looking down on the confluence of the Jamuna and the Ganga, and he's seeing all these sadhus doing the Kumbh Mela.
Indeed.
And he gets people to paint them.
He does, but at the same time, there were periods of rapprochement with his father. So at the same time, he was occasionally going back to the court and working with Akbar's painters. I mean, looking at what they were doing, taking out paintings, inspecting it and presumably adding to it.
But again, I mean, the crucial thing for anyone that's brought up with the kind of BJP vision of history, that from the beginning you have Mughal Muslim emperors commissioning works on yoga
Of course.
and on Hindu texts.
Of course, yeah.
Malini, do you want to talk a little bit about the way that the Mughals took an interest in Hinduism and the great Hindu epics?
I mean, I could briefly mention it, and then maybe Jerry might want to supplement what I have to say. But at the library, we have a copy of the Razamnama, which is a Persian translation of the Sanskrit epic on the Mahabharata. And it's one of Akbar's projects from the very beginning. He commissions a lot of translations of Sanskrit texts into Persian to be used at the court. And these become illustrated copies that can be, that were included in the Imperial Library. And with the Razamnama, is there more than one copy? I can't, this isn't my area, I'm an 18th century person.
Two great Akbari copies of
Right.
the Razamnama and the Ramayana are still in India. They're the collections of the Maharaja of Jaipur.
Hold the microphone, 'cause I think it's something. Hold it closer to your mouth. We can hear you better.
Is that right?
Yeah, better, much better.
Yeah. Sorry, shall I say that again?
Yeah.
Right. The two, in the 1580s, Akbar commissioned the two major translations from the Sanskrit of the Mahabharata, which became the Razamnama, the Book of Battles, and the Ramayana. And they were finished by 1588, if I remember correctly. And these remained in the Royal Library for generations. They're huge manuscripts, like the other historical manuscripts which were commissioned in the 1580s, with something like 150 paintings in each on a grand scale. And unlike Persian manuscripts, which confined the paintings mostly to within the text panel, these great Mughal manuscripts spread outside the frame, and so they often cover the entire page with the picture. Anyway, the two epic manuscripts are still in India, and they're in the collection of the Maharajas of Jaipur, and have scarcely ever seen. Haven't been seen in public since
Locked in a box, aren't they?
1947, I think, the Great Exhibition.
No one knows whether they're still extant because they were locked away due to a legal case,
Yes.
and the Indian Supreme Court won't allow these boxes to be opened. And so whether the manuscript is intact or whether it's been eaten up by rodents or anything else, no one knows.
I'm afraid so, yes. Anyway, these Akbar had these manuscripts commissioned, two great illustrated manuscripts for his own use, and then he encouraged his nobles to have similar manuscripts made, and one of the key ones is a lesser copy of the Razamnama, 1598-1599, of which was a chunk here. That was done in the Imperial Library. And then other noblemen, like Abdurrahim Khan, his chief minister, his head of the army, had similar manuscripts, and his Ramayana survives, which is in the Freer Gallery in Washington.
So this business of now commissioning artists is moving out from the imperial family to other noblemen are also getting in on the act and commissioning stuff?
Yeah, to a very select number, yes.
Because it's very expensive? Or?
Extremely, because the Khan had his own manuscript studio, and we know of his productions from the 1580s right through to the 1610s. So 30 years of maintaining his scriptorium, his getting the paper, getting the scribes to write all this stuff, and then a number of artists, a smaller number than Akbar had, but a considerable number to actually illustrate this material. It's incredibly expensive.
We should perhaps say at this point, having just put the Aga Khan Foundation sponsorship away, that the Aga Khan Foundation has just paid the same thing that's paying for this today. It's just done an incredible restoration project of Kani Kanan's wife's tomb. Anyone that knows Nizamuddin in Delhi will know that rather sort of bare tomb, stripped of its outside stones in the middle of Nizamuddin East, which was built by Kani Kanan on the scale of an imperial tomb for his wife.
Yes.
In the same, but no one makes a fuss about this monument to love or anything else when it's Kani Kanan. Anyway, we should thank the Aga Khan Foundation for all these wonderful objects before we put them down on the floor again. So So Jahangir comes to power, and he takes an incredible interest in art. He writes about it in his diary. He, Sue, do you want to talk about this? He singles out master artists and calls them the wonder of the age. And
Well, what happens then is that the situation when Jahangir becomes emperor is completely different from that of his father, because for a start he's 38. He already has his own artist attached to his household, and he is a mature man with a very peaceful kingdom and frankly not much interest in waging war. He'd rather look at the manuscripts and the other artifacts that he's commissioning. But the significant difference is that after about 5-10 years of his reign, he starts to move well away from the regional capitals. The Mughals always move between Agra, Delhi and Lahore and then into Kashmir. But he embarks on this huge trip to Gujarat. He stays for 3 years in Ajmer, where the Sufi Chishti shrine is. And the artists go with him, and it's a much smaller number. I think when Akbar's reign came to an end, he had his court chronicler said that there were more than 100 artists of very high standing. Jahangir had far fewer, and they also moved with the court when it travelled. And this was a huge tented city that moved across into Gujarat and then back into Agra. The artists moved with him, and their materials, of course, were very small, very portable. And they were making pictures and even manuscripts as the court moved. And so you have these artists who are occasionally mentioned by name in his own memoir, the Jahangirnameh, the Book of Jahangir. But more often we can reconstruct parts of their careers from the signatures on the paintings that they left. But it's worth mentioning that we know so little about them. I mean, we don't know the birth, death date of any of them.
And what is the status of these people? Are they mere craftsmen, or are they regarded as geniuses?
Certainly, well, as you say, they're given titles like the wonder of the age, the wonder of the time. And one presumes by comparison with, say, the head of the goldsmiths department, who was an Iranian called Saidar, that he would occasionally be given huge cash presents. And their houses these were mansions. The elite of the artists and craftsmen lived in mansions, perhaps in quarters which were devoted to, say, Iranian immigrants, of whom there were several at court. So we can sort of reconstruct bits of it without knowing for a fact. We don't know that. We don't have their wage.
But are you saying that the goldsmiths were higher status than the artists?
No, I'm not saying by comparison. The head of the goldsmiths was very highly paid, so I expect that the master painters would be as well.
He was originally?
He was, well, not originally, he was simultaneously, and that's another aspect of these people, that they may be known now as just as painters, as Mansour, one of the great artists of Jahangir's reign, was certainly a master painter, but he was probably also a designer and someone who designed objects, and that's another skill. So he might design ornamentation for metalware and things like that. So they were complex characters.
And today we get very excited about the paintings, obviously. But at the time, calligraphy was regarded as a higher art.
It was, yes. And I mean, Katherine might want to talk more, because she's the Persian expert amongst us.
Yes, well, so the Mughals regarded calligraphy as an extremely important art. I mean, largely because it is sanctioned in the Quran as a very high art form. But it wasn't just calligraphy. They also valued the spoken word, the spoken poetry extremely highly. And in the 17th century, which we're now talking about, it's not just Persian poetry, which of course, all the great poets, Hafez, Jami, and the great Indian poets, Indian Persian poet Amir Khusro, but also Rajbhasha poetry. So classical Hindi poetry was really taking off as a courtly art form as well. And the Mughals paid, I think the highest Mughal era value for an illustrated book is a set of it's a book illustrated of Nizami, and I think John Saylor says that it was 20,000 rupees, valued at 20,000 rupees. I'm looking at my art historian colleagues so that they can correct me if I'm incorrect on any art historical details. and one poet who was also a musician and a music theorist in the reign of Aurangzeb Alamgir spouted a spontaneous couplet to the emperor, and the emperor immediately bestowed upon him 7,000 rupees. Which is a large sum, and the great Tansen, the greatest musician of them all, of Akbar's reign, one of Akbar's 9 gems, was paid 200,000 rupees for one performance. So the valuing of spoken poetry, of live poetry, and of music was regarded, even more highly than poetry.
Abul Faisal
than
specifically
painting.
links poetry and calligraphy, doesn't he?
Yes.
He says it's the way that you can put the poetry of the soul onto the page.
That's right, and it's regarded, as connected art forms, as this kind of, you get this flow through, and you also get internal rhymes in poetry that is actually reflected in the calligraphic form of the letters. So you get this kind of rhyming in the form of the letters, which is absolutely beautiful.
But you could also say that Abul Fazl does mention that the art of calligraphy is much more valuable than the art of painting as part of his historical account.
Absolutely.
So that automatically displaces painting a bit lower.
But nonetheless, the paintings that are produced are just absolutely beautiful, wonderful masterworks. It was sort of hard to imagine now that they could have valued them as not as equal as some of these other art forms.
But it is the art of the book. So these are beautifully calligraphed manuscripts which have paintings by the finest artists of each reign.
So we move from Jahangir through now to Shah Jahan and the great Padshahnama project, which neither of you have got your hands on because it's in Windsor.
That's
Well,
right.
we've seen it. We've seen it.
The Queen's got it. So is that, would you regard that as, in a sense, the climax of Mughal art? Which would...
No, because that's a complicated manuscript. It has certain paintings which were produced for Shah Jahan. I think Shah Jahan's legacy is the great ornamented albums which combined calligraphy by great masters of the past, mostly Iranian, and probably early 16th century, which were then illuminated, these pages of calligraphy were illuminated in the reign of Jahangir and then bound up into volumes where you would have alternating openings of 2 pages of calligraphy, and you'd turn the page and you would have 2 paintings. And the characteristic feature of these is that they have marvellously decorated floral borders, and it's the flower ornamentation that becomes the hallmark of Shah Jahan's reign, across everything, across all the art.
Who puts more resources into the manuscript workshop? Is it Jahangir's reign, or is it Akbar's reign, or Shah Jahan?
Absolutely no idea, but I would guess Akbar, would you? I would guess Akbar because of the profusion of manuscripts that were being produced, the number of artists.
And the huge projects putting these long historical chronicles and long epics
And
into...
translations.
And translations of
Mahabharata,
Sanskrit.
So, continuing our gallop, as we've only got an hour to do the whole of Mughal art, as everyone knows, Aurangzeb then seizes power and destroys all painting, bans all music, and ends the art. Isn't that so, Katherine?
Okay, so Aurangzeb was, of course, the Mughal emperor that everybody loves to hate. So he was renowned for his piety and for his orthodoxy, which meant something actually a little different from what it means today. It's not the fundamentalist Islam that we see today, leaving the theology of that aside. He usurped the throne in 1658 from his father Shah Jahan, and he killed his brothers, and most notably the great translator of Sanskrit works on theology, Dara Shikoh. And there's a beautiful painting of Dara in this library.
Which is also on display. The Dara Shikoh album is on display at the moment, 500 yards away.
Mind you, pretty much every Mughal emperor had one of their sons, at least one of their sons, rise up against them. And probably if one of the other brothers had won, they would have killed Aurangzeb. So it's, you know, it was part of the kind of the Mughal succession
Just what you did.
disputes. It's what you did. If you don't have a system of primogeniture, you know, you have to kill everybody who's your rival, don't you?
I mean, obviously. Yeah.
So, but he rested a lot of his authority on his piety. And as is commonly, the common understanding is that in 1668, which was his 10th regnal year, and it was also his 50th solar birth year, he banned music, and he banned painting, and he banned the writing of historical chronicles, and he banned astrology, and he banned court poetry, and he chucked all Hindus out of public office. And this is in, you know, sort of texts, historical chronicles dating from after his reign. So, except that, if you actually look at the manuscript evidence, and if you look at the painted evidence, none of these things actually stack up. So the area that I know best is music. And there's a famous story about Aurangzeb banning music and the musicians coming out with carrying coffins and wailing and crying and saying, music is dead. Rag, the melodic mode. Rag is dead. You have killed Rag. And Aurangzeb looks down from the Jaipur darshan and says, bury Rag so deep under the earth that no note will ever be heard from her ever again. Right, okay. In fact, there are more music treatises written on music in Persian, translations from Sanskrit into Persian by Mughal mansabdars between the years of 1660 and 1700 than in the previous 500 years of Muslim rule in India. It was in Aurangzeb Alamgir's reign that music theory was canonized, was systematized. He maintained his atelier of musicians. We continue to get evidence of him giving them robes of honor and of land grants and of them being on retainer in the 1670s. They were still writing manuscripts for him and giving them to him as late as the 1690s. What did happen was that in 1668 he instructed that the musicians would not be permitted to sing in his presence anymore, because for him music was so fundamentally moved him. His two favorite wives were both dancing girls.
Were both?
Dancing girls. Hirabai Zainabadi, who died sadly in 1653, and Udaipuri Bai, the mother of one of his favorite sons, Khan Baksh. He loved music so much that it was far too much of a distraction for him as a pious Muslim for him to be able to listen to it at all. So he said the musicians shall be commanded to come to court, and they can continue to have be paid and all of those kinds of things, kept on retainer, but they must not perform for me. They must not perform for me. And we don't actually know exactly how long this lasted.
So is the image of him as a kind of miserable old Puritan bugger not really warranted, or?
He absolutely was a Puritan, and he was orthodox, and this is, you know, undoubtedly the case that he was puritanical in lots of respects. He introduced the jizya tax and all of those kinds of things, but it meant something different then than it means now. And he is on record as having said to his noblemen, music is not haram, it's not forbidden, it is mubah. It is neither good nor bad. So for him it was bad because it was too much of a distraction. But the greatest patron of the day was his son, Muhammad Azam Shah, who was also a great painter, a great poet, a great musician himself, and he also patronized Bhavanidas, not Bhavanidas, Chitterman, the second, the painter, who was probably floating around somehow on retainer, still in the imperial court, as was his uncle, Chitterman II's uncle Bhavanidas.
But the evidence is that less money is being put into painting.
Absolutely. So there is the atelier is much, much smaller. It seems to be concentrated on portraits, or musicians are moving elsewhere. And this leads to a huge diversification of style.
Bhavani Das, we know, goes to Kishangarh.
That's right. So Bhavani Das first goes to Bahadur Shah, who succeeds Aurangzeb, and then from Bahadur Shah's court moves eventually in 1719 to Kishangarh. His son Dalchand is also with his father, working with his father, and then also at a certain point moves to Jodhpur and then to Kishangarh.
So we have a kind of slow sloughing off. And then, like the Restoration in England, like Charles II coming back after Oliver Cromwell, suddenly all the dancing girls are welcome back because it's Muhammad Shah's time.
Am I allowed to say something about Aurangzeb first?
You can do whatever you like, Mum.
I think it's quite important to note that, as Catherine said, you know, there was a painting tradition, especially at the very start of his reign. And in fact, there's some of the loveliest intimate portraits, I would say, of Aurangzeb come from the first year of his reign. And it's painted by a Hindu artist called Untitled Chapter.
Beautiful.
And it's a lovely pen and ink drawing, and it says it's painted in the very first year of his reign. And Untitled Chapter paints just a handful of portraits of Aurangzeb and one of his sons, whose name Azam Shah, and as well as a couple of the ministers at his court. So it's a fledgling tradition. It's not going to rival what was happening during Shah Jahan's time, but it is very important because there is this continuation till about 1668. And correct me if I'm wrong with the dates, but that's when he shifts from northern India down to the Deccan.
So he moves to the Deccan actually in 1679, never to return.
Okay, never to return.
to
And so
Delhi.
that's one of the reasons why there is what we sometimes refer to as the decline in the Mughal painting tradition, because there is no imperial patron in northern India.
And it becomes very opaque, really, what happens
Exactly. And Bhavani Das is quite an interesting character because there's a very famous painting in the Chester Beatty Library showing Aurangzeb, which has been assumed to be receiving his eldest son, Muazzam, but in fact it's a portrait of Aurangzeb receiving one of his ministers, and I actually believe it's the minister who's commissioning this painting, not his son, and it's just showing
There's some paintings of Aurangzeb there.
Exactly, and that's another one by Bhavani Das in the Metropolitan Museum in the Center. But going forward, it's quite what Anita Anand said is the roulette of death, and that's what happens in the early 18th century. So Aurangzeb dies, he's got 4 sons who battle it out for succession.
And they're all really old by this point.
Yeah,
They're all in their
and
60s.
Bahadur Shah the first is about 59
Yeah.
when he takes power, and there's some really lovely paintings, including one which I've just seen in the Royal Collection at Windsor, where it shows Bahadur Shah on horseback, and it's the angels bringing the crown and something else, some other symbols of royalty. And there's some really lovely paintings that do appear, but you don't have that same style of or impact of imperial patronage as you would have had during Akbar's time, Jahangir or Shah Jahan's. And that's what happens when you get to Muhammad Shah ultimately, is that what I refer to as the revival of the painting tradition. And he's so filled with life and he's so interested in painting that we begin to see more of an established atelier of at least 12 known artists who work for Muhammad Shah.
And new colours. Suddenly it's all
It is, it's
bright
very-
oranges and... Yeah.
So no more doom and gloom, and it's very bright and colorful, and you have this a contrast.
The colours are set against white.
Yes.
It's a very
It's a
totally
really new
different
style.
aesthetic
Yeah.
to the 17th century. Seeing these brightly coloured figures and the acres of white in the background, the marble buildings of the palaces.
And it's different subjects to it. It's pleasure, isn't it? It's gardens and
Well, yes,
yeah.
but there's also much less imperial grandeur involved. Because Jahangir and Shah Jahan represented high up in the Jaroka, at a higher level than everybody else, overseeing their subjects. Muhammad Shah brings himself down. You can see him seated with his ministers and doing
In a
everything,
garden.
and doing everyday things like enjoying his garden and so on.
And there's normally 4 ministers, whereas I guess with Jahangir and the Panchanavar with Shah Jahan, it's a whole retinue of attendants and courtiers. And for Muhammad Shah, it's always very political to see who were the closest ministers to him at that very time. So it's quite lovely seeing what happens, but unfortunately you don't have those great manuscripts that you would have seen in the earlier period.
And so what's happening? The artists like Bhawani Das have gone out into Rajasthan. Are they bringing back sort of the colours of Jaipur or is it just the personal taste of Muhammad Shah? Why have we got these new colours and these new schemes?
Well, I think not everything depends on the patron. I mean, patrons can direct the sort of work that they want, but artists interpret patronal wishes in their own way to a very large extent. And, you see, one of the many problems of the 18th century painting is where do Bhawani Das and Dal Chand actually come from? Because we have scarcely any evidence that they were around in the 17th century, in the late 17th century, and then they suddenly appear. And I have a suspicion that they come from the Deccan, and the colours that suddenly infuse imperial painting are maybe linked to what was happening in the Deccan slightly earlier.
We are very nearly at the end of our time. So just to gallop forward, so Muhammad Shah, another wonderful, again, traditional books on Mughal painting will give the impression that it's all over by the end of Shah Jahan's period. But everyone today is beginning to realize this extraordinary second wind that happens with Mughal painting during Muhammad Shah's period, which was so beautifully demonstrated in your exhibition, where often to my mind, many of the most beautiful paintings were towards the end, these extraordinary Muhammad Shah images.
Actually, most of that was captured in your exhibition in New York, Princes and Painters, which focused on the 18th and the 19th century. And it's a shame that Delhi was sacked in the mid-18th century, and unfortunately what happens is artists move away from the capital and they move to places like Lucknow, Faizabad and Bengal, where they have another revival of the painting tradition under the local nawabs or local provincial governors.
So just to be explicit, so Nadir Shah comes in, loots the place, and then 4 Afghan lootings under
So you
Ahmad
have,
Shah.
yeah, so 1749, 1756, and then some subsequent ones, I suspect. And
61.
And so it's quite a tumultuous period for the residents of Delhi. They just flee. And Shah Alam II, who comes into power in 1759, actually holds his coronation ceremonies in Allahabad. And that's where you get Delhi artists painting the official...
Mihir Chand. No.
Yes, it's the Mir Chand painting, the formal accession portrait, which is in Berlin. And that gets painted at that time. And unfortunately, Shah Alam has a very difficult time, and he ultimately does go back to Delhi in the end of the 18th century.
And composes lovely monsoon rags in Maruni.
Yes,
Oh,
absolutely.
1771.
Yes. Yeah, so Shah Alam the second was a profoundly fine poet and also a musician, and he wrote this collection of songs in lots of different languages, all of which are to be sung in a variety of rags.
Some of which are now dead.
Yeah, some of which are now completely obsolete, but you can kind of reimagine their mood from his poetry and from contemporary music treatises and things like that.
So images of rains and mangoes and
Yeah,
mango
and of course
orchards
the
and swings
Ragamala
and-
painting, it seems not necessarily a new lease of life, but there's hundreds of these paintings of the musical modes as nayaks, heroes and heroines and yoginis and deities and so forth. It's a very, very old tradition. But there seem to be hundreds of them being commissioned, painted in this period.
I think one of
Despite the fact that there's very few resources in Delhi.
Yeah,
But the reason for that is because you don't have a specific patron that they're painting for.
that's right.
It's
yeah.
producing sets of paintings that could be purchased or acquired by any individual who could afford them. It wasn't, they were painting specifically in the interests of Shah Alam or Alamgir II.
So the final moment, so 1803, the Maratha War, the young Duke of Wellington in the Deccan defeats the Marathas there. Lord Lake in Aligarh and Laswari defeats the Marathas in the north. And Sir David Ochterlony, Boston-born, Scottish ethnicity, is installed as the first British resident in Delhi. And contrary, again, to everyone's expectations and all the stereotypes, what happens then is that the British do not impose themselves initially as colonial masters and transmit British culture to the Mughal court, but the reverse happens. The Mughal culture is so attractive, and this world of gardens and dancing girls and poetry, mushairas, is so gorgeous that the Bostonian David Auckloney suddenly wears Fab India kurtas and Jerry. So you have a last, most surprising Renaissance, partly with British patronage.
Yeah, it's one of the most complex periods of Indian painting. We have patrons in Akbar II, the Mughal emperor, or King of Delhi, as the Brits refer to him, and some of his artists were trying to revive the glories of the 17th century by depicting the emperor in his court, with his sons, in those sort of imperial paintings that hadn't been produced in the 18th century, but we have this. There's still quite a lot of 17th century art left in Delhi, and some of these artists were imitating that sort of composition. At the same time, we have this British influence, and again, one of the most difficult things to work out is exactly how it happened, but in the 1810s, British patrons like William Fraser was patronising Indian artists whose name we don't know, though everyone thinks it's long rumoured as Ghulam Ali Khan, but it isn't. It quite definitely is not. Ghulam Ali Khan produced this album of most wonderful portraits, very lifelike, naturalistic portraits, imbued with sort of a European sense of volume and realism, but still almost, well, totally Indian. They could not have been produced by any other culture.
In this new world, in the old world, you had the emperor at the centre of 100 artists giving all the orders, but now you have the imperial artists very proud to be patronised by Bahadur Shah Zafar, but taking work piecemeal from Scotsmen, from the Nawab of Laharu, from around. I mean, getting
exactly, yeah.
Bahadur Shah? What's the anyway? The different little sub-courts around Delhi.
Yes, I mean, Ghulam Ali Khan, who was the most famous of these artists, worked for the Mughal emperors. He worked for James Skinner out in Hansi in the 1820s. He worked again for Bahadur Shah when Bahadur Shah came to the throne in 1837-38. And then Bahadur Shah had even less resources than Akbar II, than his father. And Ghulam Ali Khan took himself off to...
This is the Fraser album.
Took himself off to Alwar, where he worked for Raja Binay Singh, and he's also involved with the Nawab of Judja, one of the little principalities
Nawab
outside
Judja going for a ride on his tiger, as one does.
Indeed, wonderful. But, you know, a Nawab sitting on a tiger is not real. It's like Jahangir and shooting the head of Malik Amber. It's the continuation of this ideal world, painting the world as you, the patron, want it to be, rather than actual reality.
But this is work of the very, very highest quality. The Fraser album is almost as good as anything, isn't it? In terms, it's an utterly gorgeous album.
Correct.
It's a very different aesthetic, though, isn't it?
Catherine,
Yeah.
yeah.
Very different. I was just, I know we're coming to the end, but I was just wondering if each of us might sort of say what our favourite Mughal bits and pieces are in the British Library.
Before we do that, just kill the Mughals off. So, 1857, the sepoys rise up in Meerut and come down. Bahadur Shah Zafar sent off to Rangoon in exile. A lot of Delhi is razed. The whole city is emptied for a year or two. Any painting at all surviving after that from Delhi? Do we know? Mazhar Ali Khan goes off to Mecca, doesn't he?
Yes, Mazhar Ali Khan, who's not matter how he's related to the other families of artists in Delhi, was a topographical artist. And Ghulam Ali Khan seems to have invented this as well. Around 1820, he decided to investigate picturesque paintings, putting buildings into landscapes. And I think what set him off was seeing the work of Sita Ram, whom I talked about earlier, who was in Delhi in 1815. So you can have a Mughal building in a landscape, and this is what Mazar-Ali Khan did, and he produced in 1846 this fantastic panorama of Delhi, which is sort of 5 yards, 5 meters or so in length, and you know, making use of European perspective and accuracy in depicting.
For Metcalfe.
Probably for Thomas Metcalfe, who was a British resident or agent, as they call him, in Delhi, yes. And then Mazar-Ali Khan also worked on an album of views of Delhi, so-called Metcalfe album, which is about a dozen of Mazar-Ali Khan's paintings are signed in that.
And so...
And then he patronage died, Metcalfe died, there seemed to be no patronage, and probably in the 1850s, before the mutiny, Mazar-Ali Khan moved off to Mecca, where we don't actually know of any work by him of showing the Kaaba or the mosques in Mecca, but some Delhi artists certainly were there because they produced that sort of work. And this topographical style actually did continue after 1858, but mostly is confined to paintings on little plaques of ivory, bijouterie, which became one of the few means that the Mughal artists who survived could actually make a living.
In the 1870s, when Val Prinsep turns up to start painting the great imperial panorama he tries to find artists in Jaipur and Delhi and says they're just copying photographs.
He did say that,
Yeah.
yes. But then, you know, Indian artists have always copied something. Way back in the midst of time, there must be one Indian artist who invented something, but after that, everyone just copied his drawings and rang the changes. This is what Indian miniatures are often about. It's subtle changes on perfectly standard compositions.
So, as Katherine suggests, the last 2 minutes, each one of us has to choose a favourite Mughal painting to put on our desert island with us when we are shipwrecked with our palm tree. Katherine.
I would definitely choose one of the paintings that's been coming up on the screen. It's Aurangzeb on horseback. It's an absolutely magnificent painting of him, about 1670, 1680, something like that, against a green background, looking very warlike, as was his wont.
I'd go for one of the Fraser album pages.
I thought you would.
I don't know which one though. Maybe Kala, the 2 pictures of Kala in the Daily collection.
Oh, they're wonderful.
Yeah.
That's not in the library. I guess for me it would be the 18th century, the Gentil Atlas, which I showed it in one of the earlier sessions. I mean, it just shows the transition between the Mughal style of painting to the company school. And I hadn't realized there were these tiny little vignettes of animal drawings inside, alongside the map. So I just discovered a porcupine and a pangolin the other day, which I quite like. Our pangolin, which Cherry acquired many, many decades ago, a while ago, which was painted for Lady Mary Impey, and that's my other favorite painting.
There's too many albums, I know, but that doesn't count as Mughal.
No, but it's on the same
You
line.
have to choose Mughal. Jerry.
Well, I think my favourite is, I mean, as a curator, you actually know your collection intimately, and you have the privilege of studying these things for days on end if you want. You know, you just go and look at it. And the one I looked at most was the famous Squirrels in a Plane Tree here in the library, which is one of the great Mughal paintings brought back by Richard Johnson in one of his albums. And though it's not signed, there's an inscription on the back saying, with a rather puzzling inscription, but I think it says it's by Abul Hassan, basically, who was Jahangir's favourite painter, the wonder of the age. And it's a great, beautiful chain archery.
In autumn, caught in the embrace of autumn with the light colours.
Yes, the leaves are golden and grizzle green, set against a golden Safavid type of background. It's a sort of Abul Hassan paying homage to his father, who was a Safavid artist, Akbar, incorporating bits of the Safavid tradition in the background into this wonderful, realistic picture of a tree with 13 squirrels, red squirrels, gambling about in the tree, and a hunter whose sort of semi-European costume is actually trying to climb the tree in some kind of vague, in a vain attempt to do something, what we don't know. To catch a squirrel, you can't. Nobody's ever caught a squirrel. So what he's doing is a mystery.
Is it any relation to the fact that the painters were using squirrel's tail, a single hair from a squirrel's tail in their brushes, or that's the relationship between artists and squirrels, isn't it? Isn't the story you have to take one hair, and if it has to be from a live squirrel if the painting is to live, and then you have to get the squirrel.
I've not
live.
actually heard that one.
Yeah. And there's a particular way of holding the squirrel with the tail sticking out between your two fingers, so that you can remove the one hair to paint with. Yeah. The artist here is... Anyway, Sue, your favourite picture?
I would choose a page which is actually of calligraphy, not in the library, it's in Tehran, in the Gulistan Palace Library, which is a page of calligraphy collected for an album of Jahangir. And I love it because in the margins are the most beautiful portraits of Mughal artists, including Abul Hassan that we've heard about. But it also, for me, they're intrinsically marvellous portraits, but it also shows the incredible intimacy between the artists who were part of the royal household. And Abul Hassan is shown as a very young man. You can see that he's left-handed artist. He has all his paintings and pigments around him. And it just gives, apart from being a work of extraordinary quality, it gives this sense of immediacy to the life of the court artist.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause. We're back here tomorrow, signing books at the inside the main library building.
Outside the Knowledge Center.
Outside the Knowledge
Outside
Centre.
the Knowledge
Upstairs.
Centre,
Yeah.
Thank you very much, all of you on the panel. This was an interesting session indeed. And this session was presented by the Aga Khan Foundation.